There are moments in life that change everything in a single night. Moments when a room full of people, a few careless words, and a wave of laughter can leave a scar that feels impossible to forget. Imagine standing in the middle of a celebration, surrounded by family, relatives, and smiling faces, yet feeling completely alone. Imagine hoping just for one evening that things might finally be different, that respect might replace years of silence, that recognition might replace years of being overlooked. But instead, something happens that turns hope into humiliation in front of everyone. Most people think revenge stories are about anger, confrontation, or dramatic payback. But sometimes the most powerful revenge is much quieter than that. Sometimes it begins with a single decision, the decision to walk away. Tonight's story is not just about pain or embarrassment. It's about what happens after those moments when life seems to push someone to their absolute limit. It's about a childhood filled with comparisons, a life spent trying to earn approval that never came, and one anniversary celebration that became the breaking point. In front of an entire room, a person who had endured years of silent disappointment realized something that would change the course of their life forever. What happened next was not a fight. There were no dramatic arguments, no shouting, and no attempt to prove anything in that moment. Instead, something far more powerful began to unfold, a journey of dignity, resilience, and transformation that would take years to fully reveal its meaning. Because sometimes the people who humiliate you unknowingly give you the greatest gift of all, the motivation to become someone they never believed you could be. This story will take you through that journey from quiet humiliation to silent determination, from walking away with nothing but dignity to building a life that speaks louder than any words ever could. And by the end, you may discover that the greatest revenge in life is not making others regret their actions. It is becoming the strongest version of yourself. So stay with this story until the very end, because what begins as a painful moment inside a crowded celebration will slowly transform into a powerful reminder that sometimes the most broken moments in life are the ones that create our greatest strength. Childhood should have been a place of warmth, protection, and quiet encouragement, but instead it unfolded in a house where silence often spoke louder than words. From the earliest memories, there was a strange distance that hung in the air, like an invisible wall that could never quite be crossed. Other children spoke about bedtime stories, family dinners filled with laughter, and parents who noticed the smallest achievements. In that house, moments like that felt almost imaginary, as if they belonged to another world entirely. Days passed with the quiet hope that maybe today would be different, that maybe today someone would notice the effort put into small things like finishing homework early or cleaning a room without being asked. School events came and went, and while other parents stood proudly in the crowd clapping for their children, there was often an empty seat where support should have been. The absence once loud, but it was powerful enough to carve a quiet ache deep inside. Achievements were rarely celebrated, and mistakes were remembered far longer than they should have been. Over time, the message became painfully clear without anyone needing to say it directly. Attention, affection, and approval were things meant for others, not for the child standing quietly in the background. Conversations at home rarely turned into moments of understanding. Words were short, distant, and often dismissive. When excitement appeared about something important, a good grade, a small award, or even a new idea, it was met with indifference that slowly drained the joy from those moments. Each time that happened, a small piece of hope faded away. It was sudden, it was a slow realization that built over years, like a shadow growing longer with every passing day. Inside that environment, a strange strength began forming. Though it did feel like strength at the time, it felt more like loneliness mixed with determination. Without encouragement, motivation had to be created from within. Without praise, progress had to be measured silently and privately. While other children leaned on their families for guidance and reassurance, this journey became one of quiet independence long before adulthood ever arrived. The house that should have been a foundation instead became a place where emotional distance shaped every memory. Yet within that emptiness, a powerful awareness slowly developed, an understanding that self-worth could not depend on people who refused to see it. Even though the absence of appreciation left scars, it also planted the earliest seeds of resilience, forcing a young heart to learn how to survive without the very support it should have received the most. Growing up in that house slowly created a feeling that was difficult to explain but impossible to ignore, the quiet sense of being the one who didn't quite belong. It wasn't something openly declared, but it revealed itself in countless small moments that added up over the years. At family gatherings, attention always seemed to flow towards someone else. Praise was given generously, but it rarely traveled in that direction. Compliments were handed out with smiles and pride, while silence waited patiently for the child standing just outside that circle of approval. Every child hopes to feel valued within their own family. That hope lives quietly inside the heart, expecting warmth in return for effort and affection in return for love. But when those things never arrive, doubt slowly begins to take root. Questions form silently in the mind. Maybe something is wrong. Maybe something is missing. Maybe being invisible has simply become part of life. The feeling of being unwanted doesn't appear suddenly. It grows from repeated moments of exclusion that seem small on their own but powerful when they pile up over time. Simple experiences made the difference painfully clear. When something good happened, the reaction was distant or uninterested, as if the achievement carried little weight. When something went wrong, the disappointment felt louder and sharper, as though mistakes confirmed an unspoken belief that expectations had never been high to begin with. It created a strange imbalance where effort rarely felt worthwhile because recognition never seemed possible. Even within the walls of the same home, it felt like living in a different world. Conversations passed by without including that voice, and decisions were made without asking for opinions. While others seemed naturally welcomed into family moments, participation often felt like an intrusion rather than belonging. Over time, that quiet exclusion shaped how the world was seen. It created the sense of standing on the outside of something that everyone else had been invited into. That constant distance slowly built a deep awareness of loneliness that few people noticed. Smiles could hide it, and normal conversations could disguise it. But inside there was always the quiet understanding that love within that household came with conditions that were never clearly explained and rarely fulfilled. Instead of growing up feeling secure and accepted, there was a lingering question about worth, as if approval was something that had to be earned but never quite reached. Living with that feeling year after year forced a kind of emotional independence long before it should have been necessary. Instead of relying on family for reassurance, strength had to be discovered internally. Instead of waiting for acceptance, resilience began to grow quietly in the background, shaped by the realization that sometimes the people meant to offer belonging are the very ones who create the deepest sense of being unwanted. Comparison became a constant presence throughout those early years, appearing in conversation so frequently that it eventually felt like a normal part of life. Instead of being recognized for individual effort or personal growth, achievements were measured against someone else's success. Whenever something was accomplished, there was always another name mentioned immediately afterward. Another child whose grades were higher, whose behavior was better, or whose accomplishments were somehow more impressive. What could have been a moment of encouragement often turned into a reminder that someone else had already done it better. At first, those comparisons were confusing. It was difficult to understand why personal efforts never seemed enough on their own. Finishing a school project, passing an exam, or trying something new should have been reasons for pride, but the excitement faded quickly whenever it was followed by words that shifted attention elsewhere. The message hidden behind those comparisons slowly became clear. No matter how hard the effort was, it would always be measured against someone who appeared more successful. Over time, these constant comparisons began to change the way achievements were viewed. Instead of feeling proud, there was always a lingering thought about whether it would be enough to avoid criticism. Even good results felt incomplete because they were immediately placed beside someone else's accomplishment. The focus was rarely on progress or improvement, but rather on the gap between expectations and reality. That gap seemed impossible to close because the standard kept changing, always pointing towards someone else who had already reached it. The comparisons did only affect school or accomplishments. They extended into personality, behavior, and even dreams about the future. Someone else was always more responsible, more talented, or more capable. Hearing those words repeatedly created a quiet pressure that grew heavier with time. Instead of building confidence, it created a sense that individuality had little value, as if becoming someone unique was less important than becoming a copy of someone else's success. Inside, frustration slowly mixed with determination. There was a growing awareness that chasing approval through comparison was an endless race with no finish line. Each time someone else was mentioned as an example, it reinforced the feeling that personal identity was being overlooked. It was as though the real person standing there was invisible, replaced by an expectation that could never truly be met. Those years of comparison left deep marks on self-perception. They created moments of doubt and insecurity, but they also quietly planted the beginning of resistance. With time, a realization began to form that constantly measuring oneself against others was a trap designed to keep confidence small and uncertain. The comparisons were meant to push toward improvement, Instead, they highlighted how easily individuality could be overshadowed when acceptance was always tied to someone else's achievement. Living in an environment where appreciation was rare and comparisons were constant created a quiet habit of endurance. Instead of reacting openly to disappointment or frustration, emotions slowly began to settle beneath the surface. At first, the instinct was to speak up, to explain feelings, or to ask why things felt so unfair. But each attempt often met the same response: dismissive words, impatience, or silence that made those emotions seem unimportant. Over time, the effort to be heard started to feel pointless, and expressing pain felt like inviting more rejection, so the feelings stayed inside. Small disappointments were ignored, and bigger ones were quietly buried. Every harsh comment, every moment of neglect, every comparison that made personal effort feel insignificant slowly gathered within the mind. On the outside, life continued normally. School was attended, responsibilities were handled, and conversations happened when necessary. To anyone watching from a distance, everything probably appeared ordinary. But beneath that calm surface, years of unspoken emotions were quietly accumulating. Endurance became a daily routine. Instead of reacting to hurtful words, there was silence. Instead of arguing against unfair judgments, there was acceptance, even when it felt undeserved. It wasn't weakness that created this silence, it was survival. Speaking out rarely changed anything, and constant conflict only made the atmosphere heavier. Remaining quiet seemed like the easiest way to avoid more pain, even though it meant carrying those emotions alone. As time passed, the weight of those unspoken feelings grew heavier. Each memory added another layer: moments when effort was ignored, times when kindness was met with indifference, occasions when personal struggles went unnoticed. They formed a collection of experiences that shaped how the world felt. What might have seemed like isolated events to others slowly merged into a continuous pattern of emotional distance. Yet inside that silence, something else was forming as well. The ability to endure difficult emotions without collapsing became a kind of hidden strength. Every time disappointment was faced and survived, resilience quietly grew. The pain did not disappear, but it began to transform into determination. If support could not be found in the expected places, then strength had to be created from within. Years of holding those emotions created a complicated mixture of patience, sadness, and quiet resolve. There was a deep understanding that these experiences had shaped the person, slowly becoming stronger with each passing year. Even though the pain remained unspoken, it became a powerful reminder of how much had been endured without recognition, and how much determination had been built in silence while waiting for a moment when that strength would finally matter. When the invitation to the wedding anniversary arrived, it carried a strange mixture of emotions that were difficult to untangle. Anniversaries are usually moments of celebration, reminders of years spent building a family and sharing memories together. For many people, they represent warmth, gratitude, and unity. Seeing that invitation created a quiet pause, as if time itself slowed for a moment while the meaning behind it slowly settled in. It had been years of distance, misunderstandings, and silent disappointment, yet this invitation suggested that perhaps there was still a place reserved at that table. At first, uncertainty appeared. It was difficult to decide whether the invitation was simply a formality or something more meaningful. After everything that had happened in the past, trust did not come easily. But alongside that doubt, there was also a small spark of hope. Maybe the celebration would be different. Maybe the years that had passed had softened old attitudes and created space for understanding. The thought of walking into that event and finally feeling acknowledged by family carried a powerful emotional pull. Imagining the evening began to stir quiet expectation. Relatives would be gathered together, conversations would fill the room, and memories would likely be shared about the years the couple had spent building their life together. In a moment like that, it felt possible that old tensions could fade, replaced by something calmer and more respectful. The invitation itself seemed to open a small door that had been closed for a long time. Preparing mentally for the event became its own emotional journey. Questions filled the mind about how the evening would unfold. Would there be genuine conversations? Would there finally be a sense of belonging that had been missing for so many years? Even a small gesture of kindness or recognition could have meant a great deal after everything that had been endured. The thought of hearing words that acknowledged personal growth or effort felt like something worth hoping for, even if that hope felt fragile. Accepting the invitation meant choosing to believe, at least for a moment, that reconciliation was possible. It meant stepping back into a space that had once been filled with disappointment but might now hold the potential for something different. That decision required courage because returning to a place tied to painful memories always carries risk. Yet the possibility of healing, even if it seemed distant, made the choice feel worthwhile. As the day of the celebration approached, anticipation slowly replaced hesitation. It felt like standing at the edge of an important moment, one that could reshape old relationships, or at least offer clarity about where things truly stood. The invitation was more than just a request to attend a party. It represented a chance, however small, for acknowledgement, respect, and perhaps the beginning of something that had never fully existed before. After deciding to attend the anniversary celebration, a quiet sense of hope began to grow. Even though past experiences had taught that expectations should remain low, the mind started to imagine possibilities that had never truly existed before. Perhaps the invitation meant that time had changed things. Years had passed, people had grown older, and sometimes distance has a way of softening old attitudes. It felt possible that this gathering might not simply be a celebration of a marriage, but also a chance for something deeper, a moment where old misunderstandings could fade and recognition could finally appear. That thought stayed present in the days leading up to the event. Memories of the past still existed, but alongside them was a fragile optimism. Maybe the anniversary would bring everyone together in a different spirit. Family members would be present, conversations would flow, and in that atmosphere there might finally be space for acknowledgement. Even a simple gesture of kindness, a moment of appreciation, or a sincere conversation could have meant more than years of silence. The hope was not about dramatic apologies or emotional speeches. It was something much simpler and far more personal. It was the quiet wish to be seen and valued, even briefly. After spending so much of life feeling overlooked, the idea that a family celebration might open the door to understanding felt powerful. It created the image of standing among relatives not as an outsider, but as someone whose presence actually mattered. Thoughts about the evening often drifted toward small possibilities. Perhaps during the celebration there would be a conversation that acknowledged the years that had passed. Maybe someone would recognize the effort it took to grow and move forward despite the past. In a setting where people shared stories about family and memories, it seemed natural to believe that recognition might finally find its way into the room. This hope slowly reshaped the way the event was imagined. Instead of seeing it only as a gathering of relatives, it started to feel like an opportunity for closure or renewal. Even if nothing dramatic happened, just being welcomed warmly could change how those old memories were carried. The idea that time might have created room for respect and understanding made the invitation feel meaningful. Carrying that hope into the days before the anniversary required courage, because hope always carries the risk of disappointment. Yet, it was impossible to ignore the quiet desire that things could be different this time. After years of distance and silent endurance, even the smallest possibility of reconciliation felt worth believing in. At least for one evening that had the potential to reshape how the past was remembered. As the day of the anniversary celebration approached, preparation became more than simply choosing clothes or planning the journey to the venue. It carried emotional weight that was difficult to ignore. Every small decision felt connected to the quiet hope that the evening might unfold differently than the past had suggested. Standing in front of a mirror while getting ready, there was a mixture of anticipation and nervous energy that made the moment feel unusually significant. Choosing what to wear took longer than expected. It wasn't about impressing anyone in a superficial way, but about presenting the best version of oneself. Years had passed since those earlier experiences of neglect and comparison, and a lot had changed internally during that time. There was a quiet desire to show growth without needing to say it aloud. Clothing became a symbol of that effort, something respectful, simple, and confident enough to reflect the person who had endured so much and continued moving forward. While preparing, memories from childhood occasionally surfaced, reminding how many family gatherings in the past had felt uncomfortable or isolating. Those memories created a slight tension beneath the excitement. Even though hope was present, the mind still carried a cautious awareness shaped by past disappointments. That mixture of emotions made every step feel heavier than it should have been for an ordinary celebration. Despite the nervousness, there was still a sense of determination to attend with dignity and calmness. The thought of walking into that room filled with relatives created images of conversations, smiles, and the possibility that things might feel different this time. Preparing carefully felt like a way of honoring the chance being given, even if its outcome remained uncertain. Before leaving, there was a moment of quiet reflection. Looking at the reflection in the mirror brought an awareness of how much life had changed since those difficult years. The person staring back was no longer the uncertain child who silently endured comparisons and neglect. Strength had grown in the background over time, shaped by every challenge faced alone. That realization created a quiet confidence that had not existed before. Even with that inner strength, nervousness remained present. Walking into a room filled with family after years of emotional distance can never feel completely easy. Questions lingered about how the evening would unfold, what conversations might occur, and whether those hopes for acknowledgement would finally become reality. Yet beneath the uncertainty was a steady determination to face the moment with composure, knowing that simply showing up required courage built from years of quiet resilience. Arriving at the anniversary celebration brought an immediate rush of sensations that felt both familiar and distant at the same time. The venue was filled with warm lights, soft music, and the sound of conversations blending together in a constant hum. Laughter floated through the air as relatives and family friends greeted one another, sharing memories and stories from years gone by. From the outside, it looked exactly like the kind of joyful family gathering people often imagine, tables decorated neatly, guests dressed elegantly, and the couple at the center of it all receiving congratulations and admiration. Walking into that room created a strange feeling of standing between two worlds. On one side was the present moment, where everyone appeared cheerful and welcoming, and on the other side were the memories of a childhood that had never quite felt like part of the same warmth. Faces that had once been distant or unfamiliar now smiled politely as greetings were exchanged. Some relatives offered friendly nods, while others seemed surprised to see that much time had passed and life had clearly moved forward. Every step inside the venue carried quiet observation. Conversations echoed around the room, and groups of guests gathered in small circles discussing family updates, careers, and stories from the past. It was easy to notice how comfortable everyone seemed, as though the room itself was built from years of shared experiences. Watching those interactions stirred a mixture of curiosity and reflection. There was a sense of being present within the gathering while still feeling slightly separate from it. Seeing parents surrounded by guests created another layer of emotion. They stood confidently at the center of the celebration, receiving compliments about their long marriage and the life they had built together. People admired their commitment and spoke warmly about the family they had created. Listening to those praises created a quiet contrast between the public image being celebrated and the private memories carried silently inside. Despite those conflicting thoughts, there was still an effort to remain calm and respectful throughout the evening. The event was meant to honor an important milestone, and disrupting that atmosphere never crossed the mind. Instead, there was a quiet determination to observe, participate politely when necessary, and allow the evening to unfold naturally. Standing among relatives and guests also brought a subtle awareness of how much time had passed since childhood. Many people present had once known a younger version who rarely spoke and stayed mostly in the background. Now the years had changed that presence, adding confidence and maturity that were impossible to ignore. Even so, the atmosphere remained unpredictable, as if the evening held moments that could either confirm the quiet hopes carried into the room or reveal something entirely different hidden beneath the celebration's cheerful surface. As the evening progressed, the celebration slowly moved toward the part everyone had been waiting for: the speeches. Guests gathered closer to the center of the room, conversations quieted, and attention shifted toward the couple whose anniversary had brought everyone together. The atmosphere was cheerful and expectant, filled with the kind of energy that usually surrounds heartfelt stories and warm memories. People smiled, glasses were raised, and relatives prepared to listen as different family members shared their thoughts about the years of marriage being celebrated. At first, the words spoken were exactly what anyone would expect at such a celebration. Stories about the past were told with laughter, and guests reacted warmly to familiar moments from earlier years. Compliments were offered about dedication, perseverance, and the strength of the relationship that had lasted so long. The room responded with applause and smiles, reinforcing the joyful atmosphere that surrounded the evening. Then the attention unexpectedly shifted. During the speech, the conversation turned toward family and the experiences of raising children. What initially sounded like another harmless story slowly began to feel different. Instead of affectionate memories or proud reflections, the tone carried something sharper hidden beneath the humor. Comments were made that sounded like jokes to the audience, but carried deeper meaning for the one person who understood the full history behind them. Laughter began to ripple through the crowd as those remarks continued. Guests reacted as though they were hearing lighthearted family anecdotes, unaware of the weight those words carried. To them, it was simply entertainment, a playful way of sharing stories that made the audience smile. But standing there in that moment, it felt very different. Each sentence seemed to pull old memories into the spotlight. exposing personal struggles and insecurities that had never been meant for public amusement. The realization arrived slowly but unmistakably. The speech had turned into a performance built at someone else's expense. Instead of acknowledgement or respect, the words created an image that reduced years of effort and personal growth into something trivial. The room continued to laugh and applaud, unaware that those moments were quietly reopening wounds that had taken years to endure. Standing among the guests while those remarks continued created an intense mixture of emotions. Embarrassment spread quickly, followed by disbelief that such words could be spoken so casually in front of everyone present. The celebration that had once carried the possibility of reconciliation now felt like a stage where private struggles had been turned into entertainment, leaving a silence inside that was far louder than the laughter echoing through the room. As the remarks continued and the laughter filled the room, the atmosphere began to feel strangely distant, almost unreal. What sounded like harmless jokes to the audience carried a different meaning for the person standing there. Each laugh echoed louder than it should have, turning simple amusement into something far heavier. The room was full of people, relatives, family, friends, familiar faces from the past, and yet in that moment, it felt like standing completely alone in the middle of them. Guests reacted naturally to the speech, smiling and laughing as if they were hearing ordinary family humor. From their perspective, nothing unusual was happening. They saw a celebration, a proud couple sharing stories about their family, and an audience enjoying the moment. The laughter came easily because they did not understand the deeper meaning behind those comments. For them, it was simply entertainment during a joyful evening. What made the moment more painful was the silence that surrounded it. No one questioned the remarks or paused to think about how they might affect the person being spoken about. Some guests laughed openly, others smiled politely, and a few simply stayed quiet while watching the scene unfold. That silence carried its own message. Even though many people were present, no one stepped forward to shift the conversation or bring the attention back to something more respectful. Standing there while the room responded that way created a strange sense of isolation. It felt like watching the entire moment from outside one's own body, observing the reactions of others while trying to process what was happening. The celebration continued smoothly, yet inside the air was a growing weight of embarrassment and disbelief. The words being spoken were not just passing jokes, they were reminders of the same patterns that had existed for years. Looking around the room made the situation even clearer. Some guests avoided eye contact, perhaps sensing the discomfort, but choosing not to interfere. Others continued enjoying the speech, unaware that their laughter was deepening the humiliation. The moment revealed something important about how easily people can overlook another person's pain when it is disguised as humor in a public setting. In the middle of that crowd, surrounded by voices and applause, the feeling of being invisible returned in a powerful way. It was the same quiet loneliness that had existed throughout childhood, now unfolding once again in front of an entire room. The celebration that had once carried the hope of recognition had instead become a moment where the silence and laughter of others made the humiliation feel even more exposed and unavoidable. Standing in that room while the laughter slowly faded created a moment of clarity that had never felt so strong before. For years, there had always been a small hope hidden somewhere inside, a belief that maybe one day things would change, that maybe the distance and misunderstanding would eventually be replaced with respect or appreciation. That hope had survived through childhood disappointments, endless comparisons, and long periods of emotional silence. It had quietly followed every step into adulthood, refusing to disappear completely. But in that moment, something inside finally shifted. Hearing those words spoken so casually in front of everyone made it impossible to ignore the pattern anymore. This wasn't a misunderstanding or a momentary mistake. It was the same attitude that had existed for years, simply revealed in a more public and painful way. The celebration had become a mirror reflecting a truth that had always been present but never fully accepted. As the room returned to its cheerful atmosphere and conversations resumed, the realization settled deeper with each passing second. Waiting for respect had been a long and exhausting journey, one built on the belief that patience and effort might eventually change how things were seen. Yet the scene that had just unfolded proved that nothing had truly shifted beneath the surface. The same lack of understanding, the same casual dismissal of feelings, was still there. For the first time, it became clear that continuing to hope for validation from the same source would only lead to more disappointment. That realization did not arrive with anger or dramatic emotion. Instead, it appeared quietly, like a calm understanding that had finally reached its final conclusion. Sometimes the hardest truth to accept is that certain people will never see value in the way you wish they would. The realization carried both pain and relief at the same time. Pain, because letting go of that hope meant accepting that the relationship would never become what it should have been. Relief, because holding on to that hope had required years of emotional energy and silent endurance. Releasing it created space for something different, a chance to stop seeking approval where it had never existed. Standing there among the guests, surrounded by conversations that continued as if nothing unusual had happened, a deep understanding took hold. Respect cannot be forced, and dignity cannot depend on the opinions of people who refuse to recognize it. In that moment, the search for validation quietly ended, replaced by the awareness that self-worth would have to come from a different place entirely, one that no longer depended on their approval. As the celebration continued and the room returned to its cheerful rhythm, something inside began to reach its limit. For years there had been patience, quiet endurance, and the constant effort to remain respectful despite the pain carried from the past. Each difficult memory had been pushed aside in the hope that someday things might feel different. But standing there after hearing those words spoken so casually in front of everyone made it impossible to ignore the weight that had been building for so long. The emotions rising in that moment were not sudden. They had been forming over many years. Every comparison, every dismissive comment, every time effort had been overlooked had quietly settled somewhere deep inside. Those memories had remained silent, buried beneath determination and the desire to keep peace within the family. But the humiliation experienced in that room acted like a spark touching something that had been waiting beneath the surface for far too long. The breaking point did not arrive with shouting or dramatic confrontation. Instead, it appeared as an overwhelming clarity that washed away the confusion and doubt that had once existed. It became impossible to continue standing there pretending everything was normal, while the same patterns repeated once again. The mind replayed countless moments from the past, and for the first time they all connected into a single understanding. In that moment, there was no anger toward the guests who had laughed or remained silent. They simply reacted to what they believed was harmless humor. The deeper realization was directed towards something far more personal, the recognition that this environment had never been a place where dignity or respect could grow. The celebration had revealed that truth in a way that could no longer be ignored or excused. Emotions moved quickly through the mind: embarrassment from what had just happened, sadness from the memories attached to it, and a quiet but powerful determination that began replacing both of them. For the first time, there was a strong sense that remaining in that situation would only repeat the same painful cycle that had existed for years. The breaking point became a moment of decision rather than a moment of reaction. It was the realization that continuing to seek acceptance in that room meant sacrificing personal dignity again and again. Standing there while conversations carried on around the room, a quiet strength began to replace the hurt. The pain had reached its limit, and in its place appeared the understanding that something needed to change, not through arguments or revenge in that moment, but through a choice that would finally end the long pattern of silent endurance. As the realization settled in after that painful moment, a quiet but powerful thought began to take shape. For so long the instinct had always been to endure, to remain silent, and to tolerate situations that felt deeply uncomfortable just to avoid creating conflict. Years of experience had taught that speaking up often led nowhere, and leaving situations unfinished was something that had always felt impossible. But standing in that room after everything that had happened made it clear that continuing to stay would only mean accepting the same disrespect once again. The idea of choosing dignity over silence slowly grew stronger with every passing second. It was not about proving anything to the people in the room or creating a dramatic scene that would draw attention. Instead, it was about protecting something that had been neglected for far too long: self-respect. There was a deep understanding that remaining there while pretending nothing had happened would only reinforce the belief that such treatment was acceptable. For the first time, the decision was no longer shaped by fear of what others might think. The laughter, the conversations, and the cheerful atmosphere of the celebration continued as if nothing unusual had occurred, but inside, there was a calm clarity that had never existed before. That clarity made one thing certain: dignity could not survive in a place where humiliation was treated as entertainment. Choosing dignity did not require raising a voice or confronting anyone publicly. In fact, the strength of that decision came from its quietness. It was a personal choice made internally, a shift in mindset that placed self-worth above the need for approval. Instead of waiting for respect to appear from others, the decision became about giving that respect to oneself. Looking around the room one last time revealed the same scene that had existed throughout the evening, guests smiling, conversations continuing, and the celebration moving forward without interruption. Yet the meaning of that environment had completely changed. It was no longer a place filled with hope or the possibility of reconciliation. It had become a reminder of why things needed to be different moving forward. That moment marked a silent turning point. The years of silent endurance had led to a deeper understanding that dignity cannot coexist with constant humiliation. Protecting self-respect sometimes requires stepping away from situations where it is repeatedly ignored. The decision forming in that moment carried both sadness and strength. But above all, it carried the awareness that personal worth should never again be placed in the hands of people who refuse to recognize it. After the decision was made internally, everything in the room seemed to slow down for a brief moment. The voices, the music, and the laughter continued around the hall, but they no longer held the same meaning. What had once felt like a gathering filled with possibility now felt like a place that had served its final purpose. There was no anger burning inside, no desire to interrupt the celebration or demand explanations. Instead, there was a calm clarity that made the next step feel simple and inevitable. Quietly stepping away from the group felt almost surreal. Guests were still engaged in their conversations. Glasses clinked together in celebration, and relatives moved between tables sharing stories. In the middle of all that activity, leaving unnoticed became surprisingly easy. No one stopped to ask where the path was leading, and no one seemed to realize that a silent decision had just changed the direction of an entire life. Walking toward the exit carried a strange mixture of emotions. Part of the mind replayed what had happened only minutes earlier, while another part focused on the steady rhythm of each step, moving farther away from the crowd. The humiliation that had once felt overwhelming began to transform into something quieter, an understanding that the moment did not need to end in conflict for it to carry meaning. The door leading outside appeared almost ordinary, yet crossing that small distance toward it felt like crossing an invisible boundary between the past and the future. Behind that door remained the familiar patterns of disrespect and misunderstanding that had shaped so many earlier experiences. Ahead of it waited uncertainty, but also the freedom that comes from refusing to remain in a place that diminishes personal worth. Pushing the door open brought a rush of cooler air, and a sudden silence compared to the noise inside the hall. The sounds of the celebration faded behind, becoming distant echoes rather than something that demanded attention. It felt like stepping out of a scene that no longer belonged to the person walking away from it. There was no dramatic announcement, no attempt to explain the departure, and no intention of drawing sympathy from anyone still inside. Leaving quietly allowed dignity to remain intact, untouched by arguments or emotional confrontations. Sometimes the strongest response is not spoken aloud. Sometimes it is simply the choice to remove oneself from a situation that no longer deserves a place in one's life, allowing silence and distance to carry the message more powerfully than words ever could. The moment the door closed behind, the noise of the celebration faded into a distant murmur, almost like a memory that was already beginning to drift away. Outside, the night air felt cooler and calmer than the crowded room that had just been left behind. For a few seconds there was stillness, the kind that appears when something important has just ended, but the next chapter has not fully begun. Standing there alone brought a quiet awareness that the evening had changed everything. The first steps away from the venue felt slow and heavy, not because of uncertainty, but because of the weight of everything that had just happened. Each step carried years of memories that seemed to replay in fragments: childhood moments, silent disappointments, the constant comparisons, and the long effort to be noticed. All those memories walked alongside in that quiet moment, as if they were finally being acknowledged rather than hidden. The street outside was peaceful compared to the laughter and applause still continuing inside the hall. Streetlights cast long shadows across the pavement, and the quiet environment made every step feel more meaningful. Walking alone in that silence created space for thoughts that had never been fully explored before. The humiliation from earlier still lingered, but it no longer felt as overwhelming as it had inside that crowded room. Instead, something different slowly began to take shape: a feeling of release. For the first time in years, there was no pressure to stay, no expectation to endure another uncomfortable moment, and no need to pretend everything was fine. The simple act of walking away had created distance not just from the event, but from a pattern that had existed for most of life. As the distance from the building grew, the mind started to feel clearer. The past still existed, but it no longer felt like a place that needed to be returned to. The long walk became a quiet reflection on how far things had come and how much strength had been built through years of silent endurance. Every step forward carried a sense of independence that had been waiting to emerge for a long time. Even though the road ahead remained uncertain, there was a deep awareness that leaving that place was not a moment of defeat. It was the beginning of a different journey, one where self-worth would no longer depend on the approval of people who had never truly understood it. As the quiet walk continued and the distance from the celebration grew, the mind slowly began to settle into a deeper realization. The events of the evening had not simply been another painful moment. They had revealed something that could no longer be ignored. For years there had been a lingering connection to the past, a belief that family ties would eventually lead to understanding or respect. Even after many disappointments, there was always a small thread of hope that things might improve with time. But after what had happened, that thread finally snapped. The decision forming during that long walk was not impulsive or fueled by anger. It developed gradually, shaped by years of experience, and the clarity that had come from the humiliation earlier that evening. Continuing to remain connected to the same environment meant repeating the same cycle of disappointment. The realization became simple and undeniable. Sometimes, the only way to protect your peace is to create distance from the people who consistently disturb it. Cutting ties was not about revenge or punishment. It was about survival and self-respect. Family relationships are often expected to endure anything, but there comes a point where loyalty cannot continue at the cost of personal dignity. The evening had shown that waiting for change would only prolong the pain that had already lasted for years. Along with that difficult realization came another important decision to build a life independently, without relying on the approval or recognition that had never truly existed in the past. The thought of starting fresh carried both fear and determination. There would be challenges ahead, moments of loneliness, and questions about whether the choice had been too drastic. Yet there was also a powerful sense of freedom beginning to grow beneath those doubts. For the first time, life would move forward without the constant pressure of trying to earn acceptance from people who refused to offer it. The energy that had once been spent hoping for validation could now be directed toward personal growth, goals, and a future shaped by self-belief rather than rejection. That decision marked a quiet turning point. Instead of allowing the past to define what was possible, the focus shifted toward building something entirely new. The ties that had once felt unbreakable were now being left behind, not out of bitterness, but out of a clear understanding that peace and dignity sometimes require the courage to walk away and never look back. After that night, and the difficult decision that followed, the memories of humiliation did not disappear immediately. They stayed present for a long time, replaying in quiet moments and occasionally returning with the same sting they had carried before. But something important had changed in the way those memories were viewed. Instead of allowing them to weaken confidence or create endless resentment, they slowly began to transform into something else. The pain that once felt like a burden started becoming a source of motivation. In the days and weeks that followed, there was a growing awareness that the past could either become a permanent weight or a powerful fuel for change. The choice was not easy, because it required looking directly at experiences that had once caused deep embarrassment and sadness. Yet, each time those memories appeared, they carried a reminder of why walking away had been necessary. They reminded that dignity had finally been protected, even when it meant leaving behind something that most people considered unbreakable. That understanding began to shape a new mindset. Instead of seeking approval or recognition from others, the focus slowly shifted toward proving something much more personal to demonstrate that the struggles of the past would not define the future. The humiliation experienced that night became a quiet promise that life would not remain trapped in the same patterns of rejection. Motivation appeared in unexpected ways. Simple goals started to carry deeper meaning. Effort at work, personal development, and building a stable life suddenly felt more purposeful. Every achievement, no matter how small, became a reminder that progress was possible without depending on the validation that had once been so desperately hoped for. There was also a growing determination to transform pain into strength rather than bitterness. Holding on to anger would have meant remaining connected to the past, in a way that prevented true freedom. Instead, channeling that energy into growth created a sense of direction that had never existed before. Slowly, the memory of humiliation lost its power to control emotions. It remained part of the story, but it no longer dictated the future. Instead, it stood as a reminder of the moment when everything began to change. The experience that once caused embarrassment and heartbreak had quietly turned into the spark that pushed life forward, transforming years of silent suffering into a powerful drive to build something better, stronger, and entirely independent of the people who had once made those painful moments possible. The years that followed were not easy, but they carried a sense of direction that had never existed before. Once the decision was made to move forward independently, life began to revolve around a simple but powerful goal to build something meaningful through personal effort. There were no shortcuts, no sudden breakthroughs that made everything instantly better. Instead, progress came through small steps taken consistently day after day, guided by determination that had been shaped by past experiences. Hard work became a daily routine rather than a temporary effort. Every morning began with the awareness that success would not arrive through luck or sympathy from others. It would come only through persistence and discipline. The memories of the past often returned during difficult moments, but instead of weakening motivation, they strengthened it. Each challenge faced along the way felt like another opportunity to prove that the humiliation and neglect from earlier years had not destroyed confidence. Self-growth slowly became the center of life. Time that had once been spent hoping for recognition from others was now invested in learning new skills, improving knowledge, and building a stable future. There was a deep understanding that independence required both patience and resilience. Some days felt exhausting, and progress sometimes seemed painfully slow, but the determination to continue never disappeared. The process of growth was not limited to career or achievements alone. Emotional strength also began to develop in ways that had never been possible before. Living independently meant learning how to trust personal decisions, accept mistakes without fear, and move forward without constantly questioning personal worth. These changes happened gradually, shaped by everyday experiences that reinforced the belief that life could be built through consistent effort. Along the way, moments of doubt occasionally appeared. There were times when the path ahead seemed uncertain and the memories of the past resurfaced with surprising clarity. But those moments also served as reminders of how far things had come. Each obstacle overcome added another layer of confidence that had once seemed impossible to develop. Over time, the person who had once felt invisible in a crowded room began to transform into someone stronger and more self-assured. The journey was built on perseverance, patience, and the quiet refusal to allow the past to define what was possible. Years of dedication slowly turned humiliation into resilience, proving that even the most painful experiences can become the foundation for personal growth when they are met with determination rather than surrender. As the years of effort and personal growth continued, something important began to change deep inside. In the past, confidence had often depended on the reactions of others. A kind word, recognition, or approval from family once seemed necessary to feel valued. When those things were missing, self-doubt easily took their place. But living independently and facing challenges alone slowly reshaped that way of thinking. Confidence started to come from a different source, one that no longer depended on anyone else's opinion. At first, this change appeared in small moments. Completing a difficult task without anyone as help created a quiet sense of pride that had never been felt before. Achieving personal goals, even modest ones, began to feel meaningful because they were earned through persistence rather than approval. The satisfaction that followed those moments was deeper and more lasting than the brief validation that had once been hoped for from others. Over time, the need for recognition began to fade. Instead of wondering whether efforts were good enough in someone else's eyes, the focus shifted toward personal standards and values. Success was no longer measured by praise from family members or comparisons with others. It was measured by progress, dedication, and the ability to continue moving forward despite obstacles. This shift in mindset brought a powerful sense of freedom. Without the constant pressure to impress anyone, decisions became clearer and more confident. Choices about work, personal growth, and future goals were made based on genuine interests and long-term ambitions rather than a desire to satisfy someone else's expectations. The absence of that pressure created space for creativity, learning, and self-discovery. Confidence also grew from facing difficulties alone and overcoming them step by step. Each challenge solved independently strengthened the belief that resilience had replaced the uncertainty that once existed. The person who had once felt overlooked and uncertain slowly transformed into someone capable of standing firmly without seeking reassurance from anyone. Looking back at the past made this transformation even more meaningful. The years spent waiting for validation had once seemed like an endless struggle, but they had also led to an important realization. True confidence cannot depend on people who refuse to offer support. It must come from within, built through effort, experience, and self-respect. By learning to trust personal strength instead of external approval, life became steadier and more fulfilling. The absence of validation that once caused pain had unexpectedly become the reason independence and confidence were able to grow so strongly. Years passed quietly, filled with work, persistence, and steady personal growth. What had once begun as a determination to simply survive gradually transformed into a life that carried real success and stability. It did not happen overnight, and there were many moments when progress felt slow or uncertain. But with every year that passed, the effort invested in building a better future began to show visible results. The success that eventually emerged was not built on luck or sudden opportunity. It was the result of consistent discipline and a refusal to give up during difficult times. Long hours of learning, improving skills, and pushing beyond comfort zones slowly created achievements that once seemed impossible. Each accomplishment became a reminder that the person who had once been overlooked and underestimated was capable of far more than anyone had believed. As life moved forward, recognition began appearing from places that had nothing to do with the past. Colleagues, mentors, and new friends noticed the dedication and determination that had shaped that journey. Opportunities opened because of hard work and reliability rather than family connections or inherited support. Those moments of recognition carried a very different feeling compared to the approval that had once been hoped for. They felt genuine, earned through perseverance rather than granted out of obligation. Financial stability, professional achievements, and personal independence slowly became part of everyday life. The person who had once walked away from humiliation now stood in a completely different position, stronger, confident, and capable of shaping their own future. Looking around at what had been built through years of effort created a deep sense of pride that was difficult to describe. The most surprising part of that success was how little it depended on the opinions of the past. The people who once dismissed effort or treated struggles as something to joke about were no longer part of daily life. Their voices had faded into distant memories, replaced by a circle of individuals who valued respect, effort, and honesty. Success did not erase the past, but it changed its meaning. What once felt like rejection and humiliation had unknowingly created the determination that made this life possible. Every challenge endured had contributed to the strength required to reach this point. Standing in that place of achievement revealed a powerful truth. The person who had once been made to feel insignificant had quietly built a life that proved otherwise, showing that perseverance and belief in oneself can transform even the most painful beginnings into a future filled with accomplishment and self-respect. As the years continued to pass and success quietly grew stronger, the story that had once seemed forgotten slowly began to circle back in an unexpected way. Life had moved forward without looking behind, and the focus had remained on building a future that no longer depended on the approval of the past. The distance created by that decision had become permanent, and over time it felt natural to live without those connections that had once caused so much pain. Yet success has a way of traveling through conversations, communities, and distant relatives. Achievements that were built quietly through dedication eventually reached people who had once been part of that earlier life. News about accomplishments, stability, and personal growth began to spread in ways that were impossible to control. What had started as a private journey slowly became something others noticed and discussed. For the people who had once dismissed effort or turned struggles into jokes, this realization arrived gradually. At first, it may have appeared as simple curiosity, hearing small pieces of information about how life had turned out. But as those stories continued to grow, the truth became harder to ignore. The person they had once underestimated had built a life that reflected strength, independence, and determination. That realization carried a quiet weight. It forced a reflection on the past that had likely never happened before. Memories of the anniversary celebration, the words spoken that evening, and the years of emotional distance may have returned with a different meaning. What had once seemed harmless or unimportant suddenly stood in contrast to the success that now existed. Understanding what had been lost often arrives too late. The years that followed the separation created a life that no longer revolved around those earlier relationships. The connection that once existed had faded into something distant, replaced by independence and a new identity shaped entirely by personal effort. For the people who had once stood at the center of that painful moment, the realization likely carried a mixture of surprise and regret. Seeing someone succeed after years of neglect reveals a truth that cannot be easily ignored, that the value they failed to recognize had always been there. But by the time that realization arrived, life had already moved far beyond the need for their acknowledgement. The recognition that came too late could no longer change the path that had been chosen or the distance that had grown over the years, leaving behind only the quiet understanding of what had once been taken for granted. Looking back after many years created a powerful contrast between two very different moments in life. One memory stood out sharply: the night of the anniversary celebration. when humiliation had unfolded in front of a room full of people. The laughter, the silence of the guests, and the painful realization that respect would never come from that place had once felt overwhelming. That moment had carried embarrassment, sadness, and a deep sense of isolation that seemed impossible to forget. Standing in the present, however, revealed a completely different reality. The person who had quietly walked out of that hall was no longer the same individual who had entered it. Years of effort, resilience, and self-growth had reshaped everything. What once felt like the lowest point in life had slowly transformed into the starting point of a much stronger journey. The contrast between those two moments felt almost symbolic. In the past, there had been a crowded room filled with laughter that carried humiliation. In the present, there was a life built on confidence and independence, where respect came naturally from people who recognized dedication and strength. The difference between those two realities showed just how powerful perseverance could be when someone refused to remain defined by the opinions of others. Remembering that earlier moment no longer carried the same pain it once did. Instead, it felt like observing a distant chapter from a story that had already moved far beyond its darkest scene. The humiliation that had once caused deep embarrassment now served as a reminder of how much strength had been built since then. There was also a deeper understanding that life rarely changes in dramatic bursts. The transformation from humiliation to strength had taken years of quiet determination, patience, and continuous effort. Each step forward, no matter how small, had gradually created the life that now existed. That contrast revealed something meaningful about the nature of growth. Moments of rejection or disrespect can feel permanent when they happen, but they do not have to remain the final definition of a person's life. With enough persistence, those painful experiences can become the very foundation for a future that looks completely different. The memory of that night remained part of the story, but it no longer held power over the present. Instead, it stood as a reminder of where everything had changed and how far the journey had traveled since that moment when dignity had finally been chosen over silence. For a long time after that painful night, the idea of revenge carried a certain emotional weight. When someone experiences humiliation or deep rejection, it is natural to imagine ways of proving others wrong or making them feel the same pain that was once endured. Thoughts like that can appear quietly, especially during moments when old memories return unexpectedly. The mind sometimes wonders what it would feel like to confront the people who caused that hurt or to show them directly how wrong they were. But as the years passed and life began to grow stronger and more stable, the meaning of revenge slowly began to change. The early thoughts of confrontation or proving something directly no longer felt as important as they once had. Success, independence, and self-respect created a new perspective that made those earlier ideas seem unnecessary. The person who had once walked away from humiliation had already built something far more powerful than any argument or dramatic confrontation could achieve. There was a realization that revenge does not always mean causing pain in return. In fact, trying to hurt others in the same way often keeps a person emotionally tied to the very experiences they are trying to escape. Carrying anger or bitterness for years can quietly drain the energy needed to move forward. Letting those feelings control the future would have meant allowing the past to continue shaping every decision. Instead, a different understanding slowly developed. The real form of revenge was not about retaliation but transformation. It was about refusing to remain the person who had once been humiliated and overlooked. Every step taken toward personal growth, every achievement earned through dedication, and every moment of confidence built through independence became a quiet response to the past. This realization brought a sense of peace that had never existed before. The focus was no longer on proving something to the people who had once caused pain. Their opinions had already lost their power. What mattered now was the life that had been built and the strength that had grown from those difficult experiences. Revenge, in its deepest form, had become something entirely different from what it once seemed. It was no longer about making others regret their actions. It was about living in a way that showed their judgments had never been accurate to begin with. The greatest response to humiliation had not been anger or confrontation, but the quiet determination to rise above it and build a life that no longer needed validation from those who once failed to give it. With time, experience, and personal growth, the understanding of revenge evolved into something far deeper than it had once seemed. In the beginning, revenge had felt like the desire to prove others wrong, to return humiliation with success that would force them to recognize their mistakes. That feeling is common when someone has been hurt deeply, especially when the pain comes from people who are expected to offer support and respect. The thought of showing them what they failed to see can feel like a powerful motivation. But as the years passed and life continued to develop in new directions, that motivation slowly transformed into a calmer and more meaningful realization. Success began to feel less like a weapon and more like a personal victory. Achievements, stability, and confidence were no longer about proving something to the past. They became reflections of inner strength and dedication that existed independently of anyone else's recognition. Living a fulfilled life gradually became the most powerful response to everything that had happened before. Instead of carrying resentment or constantly thinking about how others might react to success, attention shifted toward building happiness and purpose in everyday life. The focus moved away from the people who once caused pain, and toward the goals, passions, and relationships that truly mattered. This shift brought a sense of freedom that had once seemed impossible. When life is driven by anger or the desire for revenge, the past continues to hold influence over the present. But when fulfillment becomes the priority, the past loses its ability to control emotions or decisions. The humiliation that once felt overwhelming became just one chapter in a much larger story. True revenge revealed itself not through confrontation or attempts to make others regret their actions, but through quiet success and personal peace. The ability to live confidently, pursue meaningful goals, and surround oneself with people who offer genuine respect became far more powerful than any argument or dramatic moment ever could have been. What made this realization even more meaningful was the awareness that happiness had been built entirely through personal effort. No approval from the past had been required to reach that point. The life that existed now stood as proof that dignity, perseverance, and self-belief could overcome even the most painful experiences. In the end, living fully and confidently became the strongest answer to everything that had happened. The greatest form of revenge was simply becoming the person others once believed was impossible to become. As life continued to move forward and the years created more distance from the past, something even more important than success began to develop: peace. For a long time, the memories of humiliation, neglect, and emotional distance had remained quietly present in the background. Even while achievements grew and confidence strengthened, those memories occasionally returned, reminding how painful certain moments had once been. But gradually, a deeper understanding began to form about the role those experiences had played in shaping the person who existed now. Letting go of bitterness did not happen quickly. It required time, reflection, and the willingness to look back at the past without allowing anger to control those memories. At first, it felt almost impossible to think about those experiences without feeling the same emotions that had once caused so much pain. Yet with every year that passed, those feelings slowly softened. The focus shifted from the unfairness of what had happened to the strength that had grown because of it. Forgiveness in this sense was not about returning to the past or restoring the same relationships that once existed. It was about releasing the emotional weight that those memories carried. Holding on to resentment would have meant allowing the past to continue influencing the present. Letting go created the freedom to move forward without constantly reliving moments that could never be changed. This process also brought a deeper appreciation for self-worth. The person who had once felt invisible and unappreciated had learned to recognize personal value without needing anyone else's approval. That understanding created a quiet confidence that no longer depended on external recognition. Life became less about proving something and more about living in a way that felt authentic and meaningful. Peace arrived not through dramatic events, but through small realizations that appeared over time. Each moment of gratitude, each new achievement, and each relationship built on genuine respect slowly replaced the bitterness that had once seemed permanent. The past remained part of the story, but it no longer controlled how the present was experienced. In the end, letting go of resentment revealed something powerful. The experiences that once caused pain had also created resilience, independence, and strength. By releasing bitterness and embracing self-worth, life could finally move forward without the shadow of those old wounds, allowing the future to be shaped by hope, purpose, and a sense of inner calm that had once felt impossible to reach. In the end, that night at the anniversary was not the moment that destroyed a life. It was the moment that revealed the truth and forced a new beginning. What once felt like humiliation slowly became the turning point that changed everything. Walking away from that room was not an act of weakness or defeat. It was the first real step toward reclaiming dignity and building a future that no longer depended on the approval of people who refused to give it. For years, pain had been carried quietly through neglect, comparisons, silence, and the constant effort to earn recognition that never truly came. But that painful moment exposed something important. Sometimes the people we expect love from are the very ones who teach us the hardest lessons about self-worth. And sometimes the greatest strength a person can show is the courage to walk away from what continues to break them. The journey that followed was not easy. It required patience, discipline, and the determination to turn humiliation into motivation. Step by step, effort turned into growth. Growth turned into confidence, and confidence eventually created a life built on independence and self-respect. The person who once felt invisible in a crowded room slowly became someone who no longer needed validation from that room at all. Looking back now, that painful night no longer feels like a moment of shame. Instead, it stands as the beginning of transformation. It was the moment when silence ended, dignity was chosen, and a completely new life quietly began. The past may have shaped the journey, but it no longer controls the destination. To everyone listening to this story, remember something powerful. Your worth is not defined by the people who fail to see it. Your value does not shrink simply because others refuse to recognize it. Sometimes life places difficult moments in our path not to destroy us, but to push us toward the strength we never knew we had. You are facing humiliation, rejection, or the feeling of being overlooked. Do not let those moments become the end of your story. Let them become the fuel that drives you forward. Build your life, protect your dignity, and never forget that your future belongs to you, not to the people who doubted you. Thank you for listening to this story and sharing this journey. I truly wish you strength, confidence, and success in every step you take forward. Good luck with everything you pursue, and may your life always move toward peace, growth, and the happiness you deserve.